Hi, I'm David. Welcome to A Tale. Once a week on this channel, we tell a true story from history, the kind I stay up too late reading about, told slow enough to fall asleep to. Tonight it is the story of William Marshal, a boy nobody wanted, who became the greatest knight who ever lived. Everything you will hear really happened, and the sources are listed below. There are no ads waiting to wake you, and I will tell you right now that this story ends well. So settle in, get warm, and let an old story keep you company. Good night. Close your eyes now, if you like. This is a story, and stories ask nothing of you, except that you lie still and let them happen. And before we begin it, let me give you the ending, so that you can hold it the whole way through, the way you hold a rail on a dark stair. The boy in this story grows up. He is 5 years old when a king decides, at the very last moment, not to hang him, and a game played with green weeds has something to do with it, and you will hear that part soon. He is the only man who ever put Richard the Lionheart in the dust. And Richard, once he got up, made him great for it. He is never anything less than lucky at the exact moment luck matters, and never anything less than faithful in the long years in between. He becomes the most admired man of his age. He marries once, late and well, and by every account that survives, happily. He has 10 children. He wins his last battle as an old man, saves a kingdom more or less by accident of being the only man everyone trusted, and dies in the spring, in his own bed, in a house above a slow green river, with his family around him and his knights weeping like boys. The archbishop who buried him called him the best knight that ever lived, and 800 years have not seriously argued with the archbishop. So, nothing that happens in this story can go wrong in the end. You know the harbor now. Let the ship take its time. He was born in England around the year 1147, into a country having a terrible argument with itself about who should be king, and the argument had gone on so long that people called those years the Anarchy, when, as one chronicler put it, men said openly that Christ and his saints slept. His father was a middling baron named John Marshal, a hard, clever, one-eyed man who kept castles in the green chalk country of southern England and changed sides in the great argument exactly as often as it profited him. His mother was Sybil, sister of the Earl of Salisbury, which was the marriage that made John Marshal respectable. William was their fourth son. You have to understand what fourth son meant in that world. The eldest son got the land. The second son got what was left. The third son might get the church. The fourth son got a name and a horse, if he was lucky, and the world's permission to go and find his own supper. Nobody wrote poems about fourth sons. Nobody expected anything of this one. When William was about 5 years old, his father did something that should, by every law of that hard century, have ended this story before it began. King Stephen came with an army to besiege John Marshal's castle at Newbury. John Marshal asked for a truce and gave the king his small son William as a hostage, as a pledge of good faith, which was the custom. And then John Marshal used the truce to fill the castle with soldiers and grain, and broke his word entirely. A hostage answered for a broken promise. Everyone knew the rule, including the furious men in the king's camp, who now held a 5-year-old boy whose father had cheated them. Word was sent to John Marshal: keep your oath, or the child dies. And John Marshal sent back the most notorious sentence any father spoke in that whole savage century. Kill him if you like, he said. I still have the hammer and the anvils to forge better sons. Hold that sentence gently. It is the floor this whole story stands on, the coldest thing in it, It is also, I promise you, the last truly cold thing you will hear tonight, and even this one bends toward warmth in a moment because of what happened next. They led the boy out. The chronicle says the king's men proposed, in his hearing, the various ways it might be done, and somewhere on that walk, little William, who understood nothing except that the men seemed unhappy, saw a soldier holding a javelin and asked brightly, in the way of 5-year-olds, everywhere and always, whether he could play with it. And King Stephen looked down at this child, swinging his feet at the edge of a war, and could not do it. Stephen was, historians mostly agree, a poor king. Too soft for the times, they say. But hold this picture. The king who could not hang a child took the boy back to his own tent and kept him safe in the camp for months. And the poem written about William's life 60 years later, by men who could only have heard it from William himself, keeps one small scene from that time like a pressed flower. The king and the little hostage on the floor of the royal tent, playing a game called knights, with the flat green stalks of plantain weeds. You have played it, or something like it, with a friend when you were small. Each player holds out a stalk, and you take turns striking one against the other, and whoever stalk loses its head first loses the game. William held out his stalk. The King of England swung his, and the king's stalk broke, and the boy laughed, delighted, and demanded another round, entirely unaware that he had just won his first tournament against a crowned king at 5 years old in a war camp where he was supposed to have died that morning. He stayed a hostage for many months, and then the war moved on, and the deal was unwound, and the boy went home, where his father, we may assume, looked up briefly from his maps. An old man will kneel at the end of this story, remember, in a spring room by a river, with everything in the world to his name. Keep the little boy with the plantain stalk somewhere in view, the whole way there. He is always in the story. He was always in the man. Because he was a fourth son, William was sent away at about 12 to earn his bread the only way open to him, in the household of a great lord across the sea in Normandy, a kinsman called the Chamberlain of Tankerville, whose castle sat above the mouth of the Seine. He was a squire there for 8 years, which means mostly work. He carried, cleaned, saddled, served at table, slept where there was room, and learned, hour upon hour upon hour, the one skill that would carry him through his entire life. How to sit a horse in a fight, how to take a blow and keep his seat, how to give one without losing his balance, how to make a half-ton of war horse move like his own body. The other squires called him Greedy Guts, because he was enormous and ate like weather and slept, the poem admits fondly, more than any young man in the household. Nobody thought he was anything special. Slow, they said, steady, eats a lot. He was knighted at about 20, quickly and without ceremony, because a war had started and men were needed. A sword belted on, a blow on the shoulder, done. He owned at that moment a cloak, his arms and armor, and one horse. That was the whole estate of William Marshal. His first fight came almost at once, at a town called Drincourt, where knights fought in the streets to hold a bridge against raiders. And here, the story tells us two things with a straight face, one after the other, and the second one is the important one. The first thing, the new knight fought that day with a courage that made grown soldiers stare, out in front, holding a street by himself, while men shouted at him to fall back. The second thing, in the middle of his triumph, someone killed his horse under him. And when the fighting was over, and the great men sat at supper, praising this astonishing young marshal. One of them, teasing, asked William to give him a small gift from his day's winnings, a horse harness, say. And William had to answer, in front of everyone, that he had nothing. He had captured nothing, claimed nothing, thought of nothing but the fight. He was the hero of the day, and he was ruined, because a knight without a horse is not a knight. He never made that mistake again. Learn the trade, not just the craft. It is a very old lesson, and it usually cost about one horse. Now, here is where his world gets kind to a young man with nothing, because his world had invented something perfect for him. The tournament. Forget the picture you may have of two knights and a fence and a grandstand. That came later, centuries later. In William's day, a tournament was two crowds of knights, sometimes hundreds on a side, meeting across miles of open country between two towns, in a rolling, day-long, half-real battle. Real armor, real blows, blunted intentions. Men were hurt, and sometimes worse, but killing was not the point, and everyone knew it. The point was capture. Take a knight prisoner in the melee, and his horse and armor were yours, and he owed you a ransom besides. It was rough, glorious, dangerous, absurd, and it was, for a landless young man who happened to be unbeatable, a living. And William Marshal, greedy guts, the big, slow, steady one, turned out to be unbeatable. Not the fanciest lance, not the fastest. Simply the one who could not be knocked off a horse and could not be made to let go. Other knights hit him, and their lances broke, and he was still there, like weather, like a door. Then his hand closed on their bridle, and the game was over. He went from tournament to tournament, the way a farmer goes from field to field, and the horses and ransoms piled up, and the nothing fourth son began, quietly, to be somebody. For a while he worked in partnership with another knight he fought beside, a man called Roger of Gogi, and the two of them ran the tournament circuit like a small business. The poem gives the accounting, and the accounting survives because a clerk named Wigan kept the books. In 10 months, the two of them took 103 knights captive. 103. 2 men. The clerk wrote down every name. And once, at a great tournament in Champagne, they went looking for William at the end of the day to give him the prize, and could not find him anywhere. They found him at last in a blacksmith's forge in the town, kneeling, with his head on the anvil, perfectly patient, while the smith with hammer and tongs pried and beat his helmet back into a shape that could come off his head, because it had been so battered in the fighting that it had closed on him like a walnut shell. His head on an anvil. Rest there one moment. The father had said, "I have the anvils to forge better sons," and had meant it as the coldest sentence a man ever spoke about his boy. And here is the boy at the top of his golden youth, laughing inside a ruined helmet, head laid willingly on an anvil, in a warm forge, while the prize waits for him outside. Something had been forged after all. Many years later, near the end, William told the men around him a number, and the poem preserved it. Across his tournament life he had taken, by his own count, 500 knights. It was probably not a boast. The clerk, remember, wrote things down. 500 bridles, closed on by the same patient hand that once held a plantain stalk out to a king. Now we have to step back a little, to before the tournament partnership and the 103 bridles, back to when he was still nobody, because one hard turn on a southern road is what first lifted him out of the crowd. At about 21, William was riding escort in Poitou, in the service of his uncle Patrick, Earl of Salisbury. England had a new royal house by then. The old argument of Stephen's day had ended at last in a treaty, and when Stephen died, the crown had passed, peacefully after all that blood, to a young King Henry, the second of that name. And the person William's party was escorting was Henry's queen, the most extraordinary woman of that entire age, Eleanor of Aquitaine, once Queen of France before this, and in her own right, the ruler of the whole sun-colored southwest of France. On a road in that country, the party was ambushed by rebellious local lords, the Lusignans, men with a grievance, and too many soldiers. What mattered in the first minute was the queen, and the first minute went right. Eleanor was got away fast to a nearby castle and was never in reach. What went wrong for the rear guard. Earl Patrick, William's uncle, was cut down before he could arm himself properly, and William, seeing his uncle killed, put his back against a hedge and fought the way the poem describes with its best simile, like a wild boar among wolves, one young knight holding off a crowd, until someone did the sensible thing and came through the hedge behind him and put a spear through his thigh. He was carried off a prisoner, bleeding badly, and his captors, who wanted a ransom, not a corpse, were nonetheless in no hurry to make him comfortable. The poem gives us a small scene from his captivity that has the strange specific shine of a thing remembered rather than invented. There was a supper at some castle where the prisoners were displayed, and a lady of the house looked at this pale young knight, and later there arrived for him, quietly, a loaf of bread, and baked inside the loaf were long, clean strips of linen, bandages, sent secretly so that he could dress the wound his captors would not dress. He healed around that kindness. Somebody is always taking care of something, even inside the hardest stories. It is worth remembering what a person with almost no power can still choose to do. And then came the letter that changed everything, because the queen had not forgotten the rear guard. Eleanor of Aquitaine paid William Marshal's ransom herself, took him into her own household, gave him horses, arms, money, and rank. The greatest woman in Europe had noticed the fourth son. From that day, he was never invisible again. King Henry and Queen Eleanor had a son, also Henry, and in a strange experiment, the old king had the boy crowned king, while he himself still reigned, so that England briefly had two kings, and everyone called the son the young king. He was handsome, generous, charming, beloved, and about as substantial as morning mist, and his father gave him honors and money, and no actual power at all, which is a recipe as old as fathers and sons. To polish him, the crown chose William Marshal, the Queen's tournament champion, to be the young king's tutor in arms, his master in chivalry, the man who taught the King of England how to fight. For nearly 10 years, William was the son. The young king's glittering household turned around. It was William who led the young court onto the tournament fields of France. William who managed the team, set the tactics, chose the moments, and the young king's banner, with William under it, became the most famous sight of the circuit. His favorite trick, the one the household loved to tell about, was patience itself. Hold the team back while the other side spent their strength on each other, then sweep in late across the tired field and gather up captures the way a man picks up windfall apples. These were, you can hear it in the old poem, the happiest years anyone in that story ever had. Endless summers, hard games, fire-lit halls, the roads of France unrolling from town to town, and in the middle of it, the big unbeatable knight and his laughing lord. Happiness like that always draws weather. The other men of the household grew jealous of William, and there was a whispering campaign, and the whisper they chose was the worst one available, that William was too close to the young king's wife, Queen Margaret. Historians who have sifted this have found nothing behind it but envy, and the poem boils with rage about it half a century later. What matters is what William did. He demanded a trial, the knight's kind. Let any man who believed the whisper meet him on horseback, any accuser, and if that man feared him, William offered to have a finger of his own sword hand cut off first, to even the odds. There were no takers. There was also no justice, quite. The young king, weak in exactly the way his kind of charm is weak, let his champion leave court under a cloud rather than face down his own household. William rode away with his one squire out of the golden years and did what mattered most in the long run, nothing dishonorable. He went and won tournaments alone. The kings of Europe wrote him letters offering him wages that were public knowledge and enormous. He waited. And the young king's rebellion, because of course there was finally a rebellion against his father, went wrong. And in the middle of the ruin of it, the young king fell sick with dysentery in a town in the south of France, and everyone understood before he did that he was dying. He was 28. He asked for Marshal. The cloud between them had already broken up months before. The young king had begged him back, and William had come, because he always came back when he was asked properly. Now, at the end, the dying young man made the last request. He had taken a crusader's vow he could not keep, promised his cloak to the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. "Carry it for me," he asked. And William took his dead lord's cross, stood answerable for the household's debts, though he had almost nothing himself, and rode east. He was 2 years in the Holy Land, and here the poem, which chatters about everything, goes almost silent, as if William himself never talked much about it afterward, and historians can only trace the outline. But we know 2 things came back with him. The first was a reputation that had somehow grown even in his absence. The second was a secret. While he was out there, he made a promise to the Knights Templar, the warrior monks who guarded the pilgrim roads, that at the end of his life, he would take their vows and die as one of them. And at some point, then or after, he had 2 lengths of fine silk cloth put away in his baggage and carried them quietly through every castle and campaign for the next 30 years. And we will find out together what they were for. He came home to serve the old king now, Henry II, the young king's father, one of the most formidable rulers England ever had, aging and embattled, and losing a slow war against his own remaining sons and the young king of France. William became one of the old man's last utterly loyal captains, which by then was not a crowded profession. Everything came down, in the summer of 1189, to a burning city and a road. Henry, sick and beaten, was driven out of the city of Le Mans, the city where he had been born, and as the king retreated with a small guard, the pursuit came on fast. Leading that pursuit, out ahead of his men in his eagerness, rode the old king's own son and enemy, Richard, Count of Poitou, whom the whole world already called the Lionheart, the most feared fighting man in Europe. William Marshal turned back alone to hold the road. The 2 of them saw each other and understood the situation perfectly. Richard, hurrying, was for once not in armor. William, in the retreating rearguard, was. Richard shouted the obvious across the closing gap, "God's legs, Marshal, do not kill me. I am unarmed," which was, from a proud man a plea, and William Marshal, lance already couched at full gallop in the middle of a war, with the future King of England helpless on the point of it, made a choice with about one heartbeat available in which to make it. "No," he called back, "I will not kill you. Let the devil kill you." And he dropped the point of the lance and drove it into Richard's horse and killed it. And the Lionheart went down in the dust of the road, unhurt, in front of his own vanguard, sitting in the wreck of his saddle, watching the rear guard trot away. Men said afterward that it was the only time in Richard, the Lionheart's whole life, that any man got the better of him with a lance. Everyone knew it. Worse, everyone saw it. A few days later, the old king died, broken at Chinon, with William among the few who stayed to the end. The men who had stayed loyal stood in a terrible position. The new king was richer. The first thing Richard did was send for Marshal, the man who had just publicly put him on the ground. You have already guessed, because you know what kind of story this is, that the meeting went otherwise than the smart money feared. "You tried to kill me the other day," said the new king, testing. And William, who had spent his whole life refusing to let go, refused again, respectfully, to let go of the truth. "I did not try to kill you," he said, in substance. "I am still strong enough to drive a lance where I aim it." I aimed at the horse, and Richard the Lionheart, who was many dark things but never small about courage, looked at this man and forgave him, and then did something better than forgive. "Marshal," he said in effect, "is exactly the man who will be loyal to me, because he was loyal to my father when it cost him everything." He confirmed the richest gift the dying old king had promised, and made it real, and with it, at a stroke, everything in this story so far was repaid. The gift was a marriage. Her name was Isabel de Clare. She was about 17, daughter of the great Lord Strongbow, and an Irish princess, a wife of Leinster, and she was one of the wealthiest heiresses in all the lands the English crown ruled, with the lordship of Strigul, and its great stone castle above the River Wye, claims in Normandy, and the great lordship of Leinster in Ireland. William was about 43 years old. He had been a landless man his entire life. He rode to London, and they were married in August of 1189, the tournament night, and the heiress he had never met. And now, one honest sentence, because our accuracy promise covers marriages too. That marriage was a transaction made by a king about land. That is simply what it was, and neither of them was consulted much. But the poem was commissioned by their children, who watched the rest of it, and the historians who test the poem broadly believe it on this point. So hear the result. They were married 30 years. She rode with him to Ireland, and governed with him, and at least once, governed instead of him, defending their lands while he was away, and his instruction to his men on that occasion was to serve her as their lord, because she was. 10 children lived and grew, 5 sons and 5 daughters, and at the very end of the story, which we are coming to, the old man's tenderness toward her, in front of witnesses, in his last spring, is among the most certain small facts we have about either of them. The world gave him the marriage for the worldliest reasons there are. What the two of them built inside it was their own work, done the slow way, year over year, the same way he did everything. The 4th son was now Lord of Strigul, master of castles, husband, and in time, Earl of Pembroke. If the story ended here, it would already be the best story any landless knight ever got to live. It does not end here. The strangest and finest parts are still ahead, and they belong to his old age. Richard the Lionheart reigned 10 years and was almost never home, crusading and fighting in France, and William served him faithfully and grew into one of the great pillars of England. One scene from those years is worth carrying with us. At a siege in France, at a castle called Milly, the attack stalled at the wall, and William Marshal, 50 years old, and a great lord with no business at all doing such things, went up a scaling ladder in full armor, fought his way over the top, and knocked the enemy commander flat with one blow. And then, because he was 50, and because the man was not going anywhere, he sat down on him to catch his breath while the castle was taken around them. Richard scolded him for it afterward, the way you scold someone you're proud of. The prisoner, you will notice, lived. They generally did, around Marshal. Then Richard died of a crossbow wound at a nothing little siege, and the crown passed to his brother John. Ah, John. Even people who know nothing else about English kings know the flavor of King John, the way you know a smell. Clever, suspicious, cruel, in small ways and large, incapable of being loved, and bitterly aware of it. This story does not need to walk through the whole unhappy reign. What it needs is one thread, so hold this one. For 15 years, William Marshal served, without treason, a king who repeatedly punished him for it. John took his castles when the mood was on him. John took William's own sons into custody as hostages for their father's loyalty. The same coin, you notice, that this story opened with, the child answering for the father, and William, who had been that child on the gallows walk at Newbury, had to hand over his boys and trust the age's rules to be kinder than they had been in his day. They were, narrowly. The boys came home, but sit with what it cost him to keep faith with a king like that, and understand that William's kind of loyalty was not sentiment. It was a discipline, the moral version of not being knocked off the horse. Other barons broke with John, with excellent reasons. William judged, coldly and correctly, that a sworn oath kept even toward a bad king was the one thing that made the whole world of oaths worth anything, and that if that went, everything went. Which is why, when everything did nearly go, he was the only man left standing in the middle. The barons finally rose against John and cornered him in the summer of 1215 in a meadow by the Thames called Runnymede, and made him seal the Great Charter of Liberties, Magna Carta, the document in which, for the first time anyone had quite dared to write it down, the king himself was put under the law. William Marshal's name is in it, at the head of the counselors on the king's side, because he was, by then, the one man whose presence both furious camps could tolerate. He was almost 70, and had become something rare and almost funny, a fixed point. Both sides trusted him for the simplest possible reason. Everyone had watched him for 50 years, and he had never once, not for profit, not for safety, not for a crown's favor, been caught on the wrong side of his own word. The charter held for about 10 weeks. Then John wrote to the Pope, and the Pope, who counted John as his own vassal, declared the whole charter void, and the war came anyway. The rebels, despairing of ever trusting their own king, invited a prince of France across the sea to be their king instead, and French soldiers walked the streets of London. And in the middle of the catastrophe, in October of 1216, King John ate himself sick, took a fever, and died in the night. The men around him said afterward that at the end his thoughts went to his little son, and that he asked for the boy to be given into the keeping of William Marshal, because even John, who trusted nobody, trusted him. The heir was 9 years old. Think of the moment. A child king. London held by a foreign prince. Half the barons of England sworn to the invader. The treasury empty. And in a church at Gloucester, a circle of exhausted loyal men crowning the small boy with, tradition says, a simple gold circlet, because the royal crown was gone, and then turning, all of them, by instinct, to the oldest man in the room. They asked William Marshal, 70 years old, to take the regency, to become the guardian of the king and of the kingdom, which meant, in plain words, to govern England and fight the war and answer for all of it. The poem lets us see him hesitate, and he had earned the hesitation. He was old. The cause looked lost. He said something to his closest knight that night, which the poem preserves, and which I will give you almost whole, because 800 years have not improved on it. If all the world abandoned the young king, he said, except me, do you know what I would do? I would carry him on my shoulders, one island to the next, one land to the next, and I would never fail him, even if it meant begging my bread. Then the old man took the job and did the two cleverest things anyone did in that whole century. First, within weeks, he reissued Magna Carta. Sit up, gently, for this one, because it is the quiet hinge of the entire English-speaking world. The charter had been John's humiliation, extracted by force and repudiated within months. It was, in 1216, a dead letter, a rebel banner. William Marshal, governing in a child's name, took his enemy's great demand and freely, voluntarily, made it the new king's own program. Here, said the old knight, in effect is the charter, given now by the crown's free will. You have not lost your cause. Your cause has won. Come home. It was the most disarming political stroke imaginable, and it is the reason Magna Carta survived to be inherited by every parliament, court, and constitution downstream of it, including the ones your own life sits inside tonight. Not the meadow at Runnymede, the old man's decision to pick the thing back up off the ground. And second, when the war still had to be fought, he fought it. In May of 1217, the war came to a head at the city of Lincoln, and William Marshal, 70 years old, gray as iron, led the royal army to relieve the castle. And when the moment came to charge, the old man was so eager, so purely and completely returned to the tournament fields of his boyhood, that he actually spurred forward without his helmet on, and a squire had to chase him down and remind him, and he laughed and put it on, and then he charged. They broke the rebel army inside the streets of Lincoln in a single day of fighting, that the age, with its dark humor, remembered as the Fair of Lincoln, because of the mountain of captured gear, and remarkably few men died in it, which by now you will recognize as this man's signature written across a whole battlefield. Capture, not kill. The war was over by autumn. The peace he then made with the beaten French prince was so lenient that his own side grumbled, and he let them grumble because he was not trying to win an argument. He was trying to end one. The French went home. The boy was king. England, quietly, had been saved by its oldest employee. Now the story does the kindest thing a true story can do. It slows down and goes home. In the early spring of 1219, at about 72, William felt his strength going, and knew what it was, and did what he had watched other wise men do. He set things in order. He had himself taken by boat up the Thames to his manor at Caversham, a low house in green country beside the slow water, And there he called, over the weeks of that spring, everyone the story has gathered. His wife, his children, his knights, the household men, some of whom had served him 40 years. The government of England came to the riverbank, and he handed it, carefully, piece by piece, to the men who would carry it, and commended the little king to the care of God and the papal legate. And then, with the kingdom off his shoulders, he turned to the smaller and greater business of ending well. It took him about 2 months, and the poem walks us through those rooms almost day by day, because John of Early, his dearest knight, was in them, and never forgot anything. And I will tell you truly, these deathbed pages of a medieval poem are among the warmest scenes in all of English history. Nobody is afraid. That is the astonishing thing that comes off the page. The old man managed his own dying the way he had managed everything, without hurry, without letting go of anyone's bridle. He remembered the silk. 30 years he had carried it, since the Holy Land, and now he told his knight where in the baggage to find the 2 lengths of fine cloth, and had them spread out, and told the household, for the first time, the promise he had made to the Templars half a lifetime ago. These were his burial palls. The white cloak of the order was brought, and the old master of the temple in England came up the river, and William Marshal was invested, propped in his bed, as a knight of the temple, which he had privately been all along. Because of the order's rule, this meant a gentle unwinding, in front of everyone, of his marriage bond, and the poem gives us the scene. He called Isabel to the bedside. "Belle amie," he said to her before the whole room, "fair friend, kiss me now, for it will never be given to us again." And she kissed him, and the room wept, and if you want a single moment to hold, as proof of what those 30 arranged years had become, that is the one the witnesses chose to remember. And it was in those weeks that he gave the answer his knights would repeat for the rest of their lives. One of his own men, keeping him company in the way of worried friends, raised the hard teaching of the clerks that no man could be saved unless he gave back everything he had ever taken. And here lay a man who had taken 500 knights, with their horses and armor and all their gear. Remember, the clerk had written down every name, and William considered this from the pillows, and declined, mildly, to be frightened. "The clerks shave us too closely," he said. "I cannot give back what I won. If the kingdom of heaven is closed to me for that, then it is closed to every knight who ever lived, and I do not believe it. He would go to God as what he was, and trust God to judge the whole of a life." And the room, the poem tells us, found this a very good answer. There was even comedy, because there always was, near him. His clerk raised the matter of the 80 fine fur-trimmed robes hanging in the wardrobe, a fortune in cloth, and suggested delicately that they be sold to buy prayers for his soul. And the old man rose up off his pillow one last time in mild administrative outrage. Pentecost was coming, when a lord gave his knights their new robes, and he had knights, and they would have their robes. "Hold your tongue," he told the clerk. "More or less, I have served my own soul honestly enough. Send the robes out." And the robes went out, one last distribution from the open hand, the tournament winnings of 50 years, leaving the way they had come. One afternoon, near the end, he said softly that he had a great wish to sing, and could not tell whether it would help or harm him. They coaxed. Instead of singing himself, he called for his daughters, and they came in and stood by the bed and sang for him. The poem remembers that one of them, Joan, could hardly make her voice work for shyness, and that her father, from the pillows, gently corrected her singing, told her the verse again and how it should go, because a thing worth doing was worth doing properly, even now, especially now. And she steadied and sang it right, and he was pleased. To John of Early, keeping watch in those last days, he said, the thing I would like you to keep from this whole story, if you keep only one thing, because you are lying now more or less where he was lying then, warm, at the edge of sleep, with everything done that can be done today. Death had come to fetch him, he said, and he was not sorrowful, because he knew how this was done. He would meet it, he said, as he had met everything, and by now we may translate him freely, the way he took every charge for 60 years, seated, steady, not letting go, and not afraid. He died on the 14th of May, 1219, in the afternoon, in his bed, in the house by the river, with Isabel and his children and his old knights around him, having outlived every king he served and forged, from absolutely nothing, the one thing his terrible century most needed and least deserved, a man whose word held. They carried him down the Thames Valley to London, and buried him where he had asked to lie, with his Templar brothers, in the round nave of the Temple Church, which was built round in memory of Jerusalem, so that the old Crusader sleeps, in a manner of speaking, within the echo of the city he once carried a dead friend's cloak to. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton, the same man who had midwifed Magna Carta, stood over the grave and said it plainly, and we have his words. Behold, he said, the best knight to be found in all the world in our time. And, this is the part I love, you can still go and see him. The stone knight they carved lies there today, in the Temple Church off Fleet Street in London. 800 years of the world, having washed around that quiet round room, a stone man at rest with a sword, 5 years old once, worth less than a castle's grain to his own father, laid now where kings came to admire him. History will keep him. History is good at keeping, when we ask it kindly. So, let the story settle now, the way supper settles, the way a house settles at night. A boy is let out of a war camp, and a tired king cannot bring himself to be cruel, and they play a game with green stalks instead, and the whole future of England, though nobody in the tent can know it, swings gently on that small mercy like a gate on one hinge. Everything else follows. The hungry squire, the lost horse, never lost again, the hedge in Poitou, and the bandages in the bread, the queen who paid the ransom, the 500 bridles, the head at rest on the anvil in the warm forge, the lance given to the horse and not the man, the heiress by the Wye who became, the slow way, the beloved of 30 years, the charter picked up off the ground by an old man's hand and given back to the future, the helmet he forgot at 70 because his heart was 22, the silk carried 30 years in the baggage, the robes going out at Pentecost, the daughter singing. He never, so far as we know, learned to read, so he cannot mind that you are closing the book. He would recognize what you are doing tonight, in any case, better than he would recognize almost anything else about your world. Lying down warm at the end of the day's work, trusting the fire to hold, letting the people in the next room keep the watch. Your day is done too. Whatever it held, you kept your seat, and it has carried you here, to a warm bed at the quiet end of things, which is where even the greatest story in the Age of Knights was always headed. The fire is low, the house is safe, The old knight is at rest in his round stone room, and has been for 800 years, and will be there tomorrow, patient as ever, whenever you want the story again. Sleep now. Good night. History will keep till morning.